shiny faces, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome you to the special meeting of the Placer County Board of Supervisors. We're going to begin our meeting as we do all the meetings with the salute of our flag. Supervisor Gore, if you would please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. All right, before I turn it over to Todd, I want to say that for this workshop, we will dispense with the rigid formality that normally accompanies our board meetings. So if you need to get up, stretch your legs, grab some coffee or some water, or throw something at us, whatever, feel free.
Down there. Over there.
This is going to be just a casual conversation today. And so with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Leopold and let him launch into this.
All right, well, wonderful. Thank you all, board, for being here on a different day than we normally get together. I think it's going to be a good discussion. Let me do one quick thank you to our Auburn Library staff and Mary George specifically. I know she was willing to provide this room, and I think it's a good venue for us to just be a little off-site, but still be close by. So one thank you to all of them. So today's budget workshop is really for a couple reasons. I think the future of the county financially is really important. We talked in the last number of meetings and over the last number of months just about capital infrastructure and some long-term focus on our budget and our kind of financial condition. I will tell you, I think it's pretty solid. We're going to walk through this in a little more detail today with you all, and I encourage you to ask questions and get some clarity about this. The real intent, though, today is, as I talk about the future, we're really talking about the upcoming FY fiscal year 2021 budget process. And so a little different than maybe what we've done in prior years since I've been here is really having a front-facing look at the budget development process prior to issuing targets and budget requests out to departments to review their budget and submit supplemental requests and have a conversation. We're just starting on the front end. We're going to walk through a couple things with you. One is kind of the economic outlook, both for the region and for the county as a whole. We're going to talk about a little bit of prioritization regarding our critical success factors, how it ties with our strategic plan, so I want to work on incorporating that more into this current budget year. We're going to look at some of our operating funds, specifically the ones that have transfers from the general fund into them, where there's a subsidy that's taking place from the general fund. I want to talk about that, and we'll hit on some of those key ones. And then really about the budget development process and the budget calendar going forward for 2021. So you're all crystal clear about that. We're going to talk about what we're looking at in terms of some key initiatives to at least start the budget year off, so get some feedback from you all about that. And then wrap it up, like I said, with the calendar so you know what to expect in the coming year. Like I said, I'm excited about today because I do think it's a good opportunity for us to really dial in a little about where our budget is and the strength of the county from a financial perspective, as well as identifying some areas where we just want to be proactive and, to be honest, strategic about how we move forward with our budget. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Daniel Chatney, our relatively new budget officer who's been thrown into the mix, is going to be taking the lead on a number of these items today, and then I'll be touching on some things as well. So we'll tag team to that. So Daniel, I'll turn over to you.
Thank you, Todd. Good morning, Mr. Chair, board members. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to touch on this morning is just kind of a recap of some of the economic conditions in the county. Just back in September, we had Chris Thornburg from Beacon Economics who did a presentation down in Roseville for us. So some of the information is borrowed from his presentation, some of it's been updated, some of it comes from Placer County website and other places. So just overall, statewide, Placer County is ranking first in the quality of life. That was a 2017 survey that was done. Placer County ranked second in county population change from 2000 to 2016. Household and per capita income are consistently within the top 10 statewide. As far as unemployment or employment, California's unemployment rate dropped to 4% this September, but Placer County's unemployment rate dropped to 2.6%. and that's the lowest rate over the last 5 years. It's a pretty good indicator there. Housing, residential housing permits are down 10% year to date compared with 2018. But the 2019 total housing units of 163,261 are up from 2018. So there's plenty of housing stock. Sales tax, we just received an update from HDL this last week. So we saw for Placer County unincorporated area, a 2.5% increase from 2017-18 to 2018-19 for all the major industry groups. And the 2021 sales tax trends are expected to remain consistent with 1920. Some minor increases to auto, transportation, and the building and construction industries. And then one of the things that we've talked about a little bit last week is the implementation of AB 147 and how the online sales and sales tax collected from those are going to be a bright spot for the foreseeable future. So these are all numbers that came out of HDL's most recent analysis for us for sales tax. This is a slide that we borrowed from Chris Thornburg. It's just kind of the big picture for Placer County that he touched on back in September. Overall, he thought it was going to be a good year for us. However, on a negative side, that some of the problems that exist might be growing over the next year. GDP outlook is good. Labor markets are tight, so low unemployment. Rising wages are putting pressure on profits. But inflation is going to remain constrained. Interest rates are still low. Debt levels are safe. And we are where people want to move. Some of the problems or the negatives that he addressed are labor shortages will be an issue. Again, that unemployment rate being so low. The local housing supply is going to start tightening. And equity markets are odd. Federal deficit is widening. Bank lending is still constrained. Political uncertainty dominating the headlines, especially this morning. And critical policy issues remain undiscussed at a large level. So that was kind of a brief economic snapshot of what we have. And since this is kind of a workshop forum, if you want to entertain or ask any questions or have any comments about that, we certainly
just like to get a copy of those slides.
Yeah,
Yeah.
could make sure.
Yeah. Daniel, can you remind me what AB 147 was?
That's the assembly bill where for online retail sales and how the purchase, wherever the home store is, and the tax that they are charged, and how California or local jurisdictions will receive a share of that tax paid for those online transactions.
Which is really going to be a bigger thing, especially as we're moving more online sales. We want to make sure we're captured, the
So that bill
sales
actually
tax.
says that the local jurisdiction will get a portion of the sales based on where the person lives who purchased the sale? Is that what you're saying?
So location of where you receive it is where you're going to get
Pay
that.
it.
So yeah, so not necessarily where that transaction occurred or where that business actually resides. It's where you actually receive it at your own house. So yeah. So
But it's a small portion of that
Small
overall
portion.
sales tax, but better than nothing.
It's going to grow, I think, over time too.
Yeah.
So.
Mhm.
Okay, so let me touch on any other questions about the economic piece. I mean, honestly, it's fairly strong. I think 2021 looks really as a positive thing. We touched on this around debt service and debt capacity. We talked about this last week. The cost of borrowing is extremely low. It's one of the lowest that we've seen in, it's probably one of the lowest we've ever had. And so we want to make sure, if we have some projects that we want to do, I think this is the time to do it if we're going to issue any borrowing of any sense. So I want to touch on the next topic, and it's really about our critical success factors. So back in April of 2018, we spent a good deal of time down at the fairgrounds really outlining a general overview of a strategic plan. It culminated in the identification of 9 different, what I'm calling critical success factors. We've been talking with the board about this. We've talking to the community about here are key areas that we're looked at as an organization. What I'd asked of the five of you was to think about kind of the future, think about FY 2021, and maybe a little about today of where you're placing or you feel priorities around these 9 different areas are. Right now, what we did, we just identified them previously. We're kind of moving into, and I think it's actually, I'll show this slide in a second here, but it's really a good conversation for us to have of, these are all important. But as you know, not all things are of equal importance sometimes. And so we want to make sure that as an organization, we understand kind of where the board is from a collective standpoint about their priorities and where they place an emphasis of these 9 different areas, and maybe setting the stage for some conversations we have regarding the budget come 2021. And for staff and departments, they'd like to see this as well. So if you want to hit that the one slide I have. This was, what this shows is the average between all 5 of you regarding these 9 different areas. All right. Yeah, I should have brought my glasses too. All right. So just to give a quick recap, this is a very simplistic graph, but it really highlights the areas of importance. So from the left to the right is they're just sorted by highest to lowest, and we, as I had asked you to do, was to allocate $1,000. It was just a numerical number around these 9 different areas, and what you felt was the highest and what was the lowest. And this is the average score of all 5 of you. And we can come back at a later date and you can see how your mix tied in with the average of the board. But the 2 key areas from left to right, public safety obviously identifies as the highest area, and but is complemented by the public serving infrastructure and amenities. And as we've talked about these are about public infrastructure, making sure we maintain the assets we have, we address those specific assets. So the 2 highest ones were there, followed up by what the title is Collaborative Health and Human Services. This really translates really nicely into what we've been doing for the investment that you're making in terms of the HHS building and just the investment that we're doing in human services in general. So those were the top 3, and I'll tell you, of the top 3, public safety, all 5 of you ranked public safety is one of your top 3, which, and the same 4 of the 5 ranked the public infrastructure one as one of your top 3. I walked away saying, hey, there's some unity about the key areas or the key focus areas. You may have a little differences of opinion about some of the other areas, but it collectively our key ones, everybody was in unison. I thought that was really fabulous. As we move down the list, kind of those middle 3 tiers was economic development strategies, housing, and one of the reasons why we're here today, kind of the financial planning and kind of all-inclusive financial planning areas that we have. So those were there. And then the bottom 3 were around land use, environmental stewardship, kind of the innovative service delivery model, and then strategic relationships and community engagement. Again, I don't think it was about the value of it. It was just where if we were putting money, how much would we invest in that? So, but that gives you a general quartile. I have some graphs. I'll be happy to share that with you as well. But kind of a general overview of kind of where you placed or thought your priorities at this time. What I like to do is come back every year and have a kind of refresh of this to say, hey, are you still in kind of lockstep about these priority rankings? Because obviously these change over time.
To that point, when I handed Todd mine yesterday, don't take this personally, but I allocated $0 to the land use planning and environmental stewardship only because we're essentially done with the PCCP, and I'm counting on the PCCP to take care of that from this point moving forward. And so I think as our board did prioritize over 12 years, 14 years, spending on the PCCP. Now we're at the point where that can begin to ramp down, and so maybe next year the public serving infrastructure doesn't rank as high or something along those lines because we've spent some time, spent some money, addressed it, and now one of these other things has a chance to
Actually
rise.
voted similarly, not
Oh,
not
okay.
quite that extreme, but similar
Yeah,
thing,
no, but
just
zero.
because the work was, yeah, not zero, but,
Well, and
but it
my-
was
my-
less of a priority. because-
Right, and my 2 cents, although it was $1,000, is that not all cost the same, right?
Right.
So
That's right.
at the very end, you've
Yeah.
got strategic relationships and community engagement, which is a very high priority for me, but I don't think you have to invest a lot to get a lot
That's a good point.
that is applicable to the other
So you
implementation.
took the thinking to a second level.
Uh,
I
you
was
know,
way too simplistic.
Yeah. Give them $1,000.
Well, I think the other piece is there's core functions of county government, and these are aligned very well with that.
Yep.
Typically you're investing in more core services
Mhm.
than some other things. But I thought it turned out really well, and I really valued that there was actually quite a bit of unison amongst the board around our top tier areas. So wanted to touch on that. Maybe we'll step on. Do you want to go back to the next slide? All right, so what we can just briefly walk through this. Most of these. I think these are all each of the different areas. And just kind of roll
Yeah,
through it.
this is actually just critical success factor number 6. Thought I would just point out why we're here today.
Yeah.
Try to bring more transparency and highlights to the budget process, and for your betterment and for that of our constituents. So.
All right, so we want to talk about fund balance and kind of policies, because we do have some fund balance policies. What we currently have in place, because it really sets the stage on kind of how we move forward from a budgeting and a policy standpoint, and how we develop the budget. So I'll turn it to Daniel to kind of touch on this.
Okay, so this slide is taken from the county financial policies document, and just kind of outlines 4 categories of fund balance policies and classifications. And the first one being the general fund total committed fund balance and general reserve and committed fund balance for economic uncertainties should be accumulated to a minimum 5% of the annual operating budget reserve, annual operating budget. This takes out capital, contributions to other reserves, and operating contingencies. So currently, the general fund meets that objective. Several of our funds do, and some don't. The second one, 2.52, is a committed fund balance for mandated costs. This was established to supply or to reserve a 5% amount again, but this was to benefit Health and Human Services in case of an economic downturn there. So they would have some reserves there to address the medically indigent, public assistance, and other non-discretionary costs. This amount, I think it's $5,030,000 or so, was housed in the general fund when HHS was part of the general fund. Since HHS has moved outside the general fund, that transfer has been moved into their fund, so they are maintaining that mandated reserve now as well. 2.53, general fund allocation to the committed fund balance for capital asset replacement will be equivalent to the annual equipment facility depreciation expense. And 2.54, moderate increases to non-general fund committed fund balance for contingencies should be accumulated over time until a 5% reserve level is achieved as well. So I think that one is addressing all of our other county funds not residing in the general fund. So this is our current policy. This slide is just talking about a little bit about how the fund balances should be used, or in what order they should be expended. So using restricted fund balance when available, so dollars that are restricted for a specific purpose. Using assigned fund balance, again, same concept, and committed fund balance. This is referring to amounts that can only be used for specific purposes imposed by formal action of the board. So some of the capital projects that we talked about last week. And unassigned fund balance, which is basically your unassigned reserve. So any dollars that aren't committed or assigned for a specific purpose, and just your general reserve should be used last. some of the discussion that we've had recently with the Finance Committee and with Ken Deeker, our financial consultant who helped us prepare the capital financing plan, is looking at some different models for fund balance reserves and what might be a better use or a better plan for Placer County in the future. One of the things that we took away is the Government Finance Officers Association has revised their recommendation to be a minimum 2 months of operating reserve, which is about, I think, about a 15 to 16% number versus the 5% that we're currently.
Just a general fund?
This is, so if we were using the general fund as the fund in question, that one, yes, or any other operating fund if we chose that same policy.
So if you lose all revenues in a situation of an emergency, you can ensure cash flow and.
It's really, you know, there's a discussion about that. I mean, it's a recommendation, but it really depends on, do you have reserve policies in other funds? If you're using the general fund as the catch-all for everything else and there's no reserve policy in any of the other funds, that has some merit. I think it's really a question of, you know, how we need flexibility here. And as a county, counties, since they're really property tax driven, do not, the swings aren't as drastic as what you see in the city when it's really sales tax driven. You can see major swings at a more rapid rate. Counties usually, the downturn takes a little longer, but the upturn takes a little longer. Cities, the downturn goes quick, but sometimes they can go up faster. So this was one of the models that we have talked about. We want to try and deal with some of the just, you know, where are we in best practices and how do we stand when we look at our overall fund condition.
So the comment down there with the current reserve levels that we have in the general fund specifically, we wouldn't necessarily meet that 2-month operating reserve. So there would be a need in the future, perhaps, for the Finance Committee to further define the fund balance options, bring that back to the board at a future meeting, have more discussion on that topic itself and how those things can be accomplished over time. And I think that's it for the fund balance policy. Before we jump into the condition and projections for our major operating funds, does anybody feel like they need a break yet or have any questions? This one can take a little while.
I don't need a break. I did want to understand what the implications were for Butte County or other counties that have had catastrophic wildfires with their property tax revenues. And given so many of our areas are at a high threat, you know, while we might not want to go to the two full months, you know, is there a higher level we should be at just in case there was some extreme situation in one of our foothill areas or
well, you know, this is interesting because Butte and Paradise and those sort, they were fortunate. They had some backfill funding from the state to backfill the shortfall that they had on property taxes, but that was only, I think they got maybe a 3-year window. Is that right, Jim? If you recall? Yeah.
And they won't be fully back, and I mean they're.
Yeah, it's going to take years.
It's going to take years. So I do think it's something worth discussing. You know, you don't want to maybe be at the extreme, but you do want to have some level of cushion.
Yeah, and I think
beyond.
There's it's all about risk tolerance. And so there's that. We also have an economic downturn reserve component built into our reserve to allow for just changes in economic conditions. And we've been, you know, honestly flying fairly high from an economic standpoint for a while. That, if it doesn't go down, it probably more or less flattens out. And we need to be cognizant of that as well because the expenses aren't translating there.
And unlike some of our neighboring counties, the vast majority of our assessed valuation is derived from those areas that are not the fire-prone areas.
That is true.
That we have, you know, so much of our stuff is you know, Rockland.
Any kind of natural emergency, though, I was thinking about with that I used fire, but you're right.
Yeah. No, we are talking about that, and obviously Andy's here too. We've really spent some time talking about what's an appropriate fund balance do we have and recognizing what is a risk profile that we have, as well as if we have reserves in other funds, should we be accounting for those having appropriate downturn capacity where they wouldn't be tapping the general fund right out of the chute. more to come in there. I think we'll be coming back with some updates to some financial policies to you.
Mr. Sisk, any thoughts?
I'll be working with the CEO's office on this.
Okay.
Because I do have thoughts on the
Yeah,
policy.
good.
There's some
Thank you.
changes I would like to make.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
one thing I think, off my head, I'd like is, since 2008 was recent, be a great stress test, if you will, to take those policies and test them against that data to see what it would have done to us. Because hopefully, and I think that we won't see that again in my lifetime. But
I think we'll talk about these.
I'm not sure.
We're going to
Thanks
talk
for
about
asking.
these funds here in a second, and I think Daniel may talk a little bit about assumptions that we made. So, as Ken Deeker kind of mentioned, we kind of have a 5-10 year fund balance projections that we've really done for all of our major funds, and we've incorporated assumptions for each of those. So growth assumptions, both on the expense side and the revenue side. So we can do these sort of stress tests to say, what does it look like based on past trend? What does it look like if we were in a downturn scenario, and if we were fortunate where things were escalating at a rapid rate, what does that look like as well, on both sides of the house, which I think is a good thing for us and why we're kind of talking today. So.
So overall, the county has about 57 different operating funds. Today, we're just going to review 7 of them.
Thanks.
You're welcome. We're not reviewing any of the county ISF or any enterprise funds. We're really focusing, like Todd mentioned earlier, on the ones that receive a general fund transfer, especially the significant ones. So,
Sorry, county ISF. ISF stands for?
Internal Service Fund.
Thank you. I just have to keep remembering what these acronyms are.
So the funds that we're going to review today: the General Fund, Public Safety Fund, Health and Human Services, Library, Capital, Road, and Fire Protection Fund. So as Todd mentioned and Ken Deeker spoke to last week, we've built a 5-10 year model that we can use, and we can play with the assumptions in there to make it fit any scenario that we wish it to do. For today's purpose, some of the assumptions that we used are reduced growth of property tax revenue. So currently, this year's increase, I think, was about 6.3%, and we've moved that down to about a 2% growth rate at the end of the 5-year model. We've done a moderate decline in sales tax growth, and we've left most of the other revenues flat. So intergovernmental revenue from state and federal governments, held those pretty consistent, along with fees for service and those kinds of things. On the expenditure side, we forecasted out salaries and benefits reflecting our annual growth projections. So basically any current known cost increases for labor negotiations and things like that. Pension and OPEB costs, we match those to our most recent actuarial reports from CalPERS, so those are all included in there for at least the 5 years out. We've inflated our operational costs. We've recognized all these same assumptions in all the transfers to the other funds. And overall, we feel this model reflects a very conservative approach to projecting the revenues and expenses. Like I said, we can use this model tool to develop any scenario, like Supervisor Wiggin suggested, against 2008 data as well. So any of those scenarios we can input in here and change them out. So the first one is the general fund. Just from last week, this is the same chart that you saw, and with the capital financing plan, which is just showing the 5-year projection and utilizing some of that unassigned, or using some of the ending fund balance and reducing the unassigned fund balance. So these are the capital contributions for Placer Parkway, for the HHS admin building, Burton Creek property, and the crime lab. So all those are still in here, and this slide is no different, unchanged from last week.
So what you're seeing, just quickly, is there is a downward slope on a couple of these. These were planned projects. I think Placer Parkway is probably the primary one. We actually have money set aside, so when that project moves forward, we actually will be utilizing those dollars. So this isn't a operational decline per se, more of a systematic, specific, these are capital items we knew were going to happen. It was just when we were going to pull the trigger to actually move forward with those projects. So that's what you're kind of seeing on kind of the purple going down a little bit.
So we're just passing out now the slide deck printed for you.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, Chad. Sorry, what page would be on with that? So moving forward. So our next fund for discussion is our public safety fund. Again, similar chart to what you just saw, minus the unassigned fund balance projections. And this chart is for the public safety fund in total, which includes the sheriff's department, probation, and the district attorney. And you can see use of fund balance starting in 15-16 and having that decline to a low level in 21-22 of just about, I think that's $1 million. I should have brought my glasses.
Which one? 2 million.
3 million in 21-22, and then starting to drop into a negative position in 22-23. Again, these are assumptions and projections out off the assumptions that we used and treated as the fund in total. So all three of those major departments are included in this projection. Any questions before we move on?
Yeah, quick question. So, unlike the general fund, which of course is predominantly property tax driven, where you're looking at revenues escalating year over year, you're showing a stalling of revenues on the public safety fund between 1920 and oh, because 1920 is in there twice.
Yeah, that's the budget column, and then in these slides, if we made different projections.
Sorry, that's fine. All right, why is it not growing or exactly the same? Well, that makes sense.
So, and maybe we just touch on that right quick. So why you see a budget number and then a projection number is we look, as we move through the course of the year, and you're going to have quarterly updates, as I kind of mentioned to you from Daniel and his staff about kind of where we're at. If we see growth either in expenses or growth in revenue, we want to show as a projection.
Sure.
And then that's used as a growth factor for the out year. So that's why that's there. It just so happens these are fairly similar because we're only in the first quarter of the year.
Right.
And what's the makeup of the public safety fund? Where are
What are
all
the
the
key
dollars?
revenues?
Key revenues.
Prop 172, right?
So, Prop 172,
Yeah.
general fund transfer, public safety sales tax.
That's 172.
Oh, that's 172, sorry, yeah.
Trial court security contracts.
Yeah, fees, fee for service.
8109.
How much of the general fund?
It's like 60 plus percent of public safety fund, I think, is general fund funded,
How much?
right? 60%. 50. Well, it's 51% of the. Okay.
So 51% is general fund and the rest
Our sales tax and these
other directed dollars.
Correct.
We're going to go into more detail, I see.
Yes.
So I'm
Yeah.
going to save my
Okay.
questions because I was going to say, what are the
And-
trends on expenses?
Step forward.
Yeah, sorry. I tried to answer my own question there.
Okay, so public safety fund expenditures by department. So this one's looking at the three major departments in their sheriff, DA, and probation from 2008-9 all the way up to the end of last fiscal year, 2018-19. This shows the total expenditures by department. So you can see the sheriff is the major, the largest user of funds, spender. I don't mean that negatively, but
We'll talk on, we got
Yeah.
2 slides down to talk about why some of those things are not necessarily the shares, they're policy decisions and others that have driven
Right,
some of
right.
this, but this is an overview of that.
So for the last 9 years, the sheriff's budget has saw about a 70% growth in expenditures from 83 million up to 142 million. The district attorney's budget, 46% overall for the last 9 years, from 17 million up to 25. And then probation, a 56% increase from 19.2 up to about $30 million over the last 9 years.
So this is, and just so we're clear, expenses here, so there's some things where public, or probation per se, has received grants. So as you know, there's a $6 million grant most recently between HHS and probation for some projects. So some of those expenses have some offsetting revenues to them.
right.
And the same holds true to all three of those different departments. But as a growth from an expense standpoint, this is what this is showing.
So, please.
So the growth in the public safety is generally, a lot of it's driven by state policies that have come down to put up for AB 109, for example.
AB 109 changes to sentencing. You know, we had, basically they took felonies and made them high-level misdemeanors, so they moved more into the county side. And then, you know, just the growth in the jail side. And we'll talk about that in a second. I think it's good to
So
have
I
some
have to
context.
assume that the growth, particularly in the sheriff's budget, is going to be driven by primarily just two factors: additional staffing and additional cost of existing staffing as reflected by our Prop F increase, our Measure F increases.
I would say that holds true because their largest is people. But as you'll see, we added 2 jails, so we have some duplication of some services running an Auburn jail and a
Right.
South Placer jail. That also has added to this mix. So, you know, obviously it comes down to staffing. But I do think there's some policy issues and some operational things that we're doing that have driven some of that over time. So, and we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
So this next slide is a little stretched, so I apologize for that. But what this is showing is just in the sheriff's department and the major cost centers within there. So the grants program, protection and prevention, support services, admin, Tahoe, and jail corrections. You can see that overall they've stayed pretty consistent with one exception, and that was in fiscal year 15-16 to 16-17. You'll see a change in sheriff admin costs from essentially 0 up to about $14 million. So I just want to be clear that those are not an additional $14 million of costs. Those are costs that are being
Reallocated.
Accounted
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 for
for.
to admin now that used to be accounted for in the various subgroups as well. So it's not new charges, it's the existing just spread to admin specifically instead of to all the other divisions.
But the nature of this slide doesn't fully convey the impact of the growth within the various budget areas. I mean, when I'm looking at 14-15 and seeing jail corrections, is that $35 million?
Yes.
As opposed to 18-19 at $63 million?
Correct.
I would expect to see that green area almost double the size, and this bar doesn't accurately reflect from a bar chart standpoint where
It's-
those dollars
Yeah,
are
I think
going.
what this bar chart is
Yeah.
just 100% of those costs divided up by percentages,
It
right?
just talks about the spread that they have
Right, this
amongst
is the
each
chart to look
division.
at, yeah.
The
okay.
next,
Yeah, okay.
So
That's a good clarification, because otherwise it looks like
It's
the
fairly
budget's
static.
staying
Yeah, it
static
looks
and
fairly
we're not.
static when it's almost
Yeah.
doubled.
correct, but you did point out that the jump between 14-15 and 15-16 of nearly $20 million on the correction side.
Yeah,
So to explore that a little bit more, here's
It's over 20, it's almost 30 million from 14-15 to 18-19. It's almost doubled in those 5 years.
that's correct.
So, yeah, so let's talk about this slide a bit, because I think it needs some context to it, and it kind of lines up with what the other items. This is really more around the detention and corrections area, and that's, as you know, Supervisor Euler, you alluded to, this is where the growth really is seen, and so maybe we can touch through some of the key points here just about that.
Yeah. So as you can see, this chart starting in 2009-10 at $32.9 million, and then escalates up through 18-19 at $60.6 million. So fairly significant increase there. And we've noted here some of the things that went into that, some of the drivers behind that cost escalation. For example, in an increase of $500,000 for building maintenance related to the South Placer Jail, which ramped it up a little bit. In 2012-13, it escalates again another $3 million to add 21 new corrections positions, and that was due to AB 109. An increase of $6 million for the first year of cost for the South Placer Jail. Jump up again to another increase for 2.7 for the first full year cost at the South Placer Jail. And then a significant jump of about $7 million that's accounting for additional staffing at the South Placer Jail, depreciation costs, and an increase for jail medical costs as well. Another increase of $2.3 million where they added 30 additional positions in the South Placer Jail for the booking processes. And then again, another larger increase of $1.3 million due to the jail medical costs increasing out in 2017, 2018 timeframe.
Yeah, so as we hit on the highlights here, I think what you're seeing is policy issues have driven some of these costs, as well as honestly some state requirements. And probably the most noteworthy one that's most recent up to this current year is we saw a significant increase in that medical contract. Things we're totally out of our control, but we are obligated to provide those sort of services. And I think the total, and Mark, maybe you can, it's like $39 million we spend on medical as a
The
whole.
last contract's like 37.
37, yeah, it's a sizable
Three-year
amount.
contract.
Yeah, so things that how do we manage that most efficiently is, we try and do, but we're also dealing with some things that are honestly outside our control in terms of this. But this gives you a good context over the last, 10, 12 years. A little bit.
And how does that trend look compared to other counties and other jurisdictions? I'm always looking for, are we in line with that? Are we doing everything we can do, to control those cost escalations? Are there other models out there that are being more successful or less successful? I mean, as we're conveying this to constituents, if we're on trend with everybody else, great. But if we're very different than that, then I think constituents ask questions. Like,
Hey, it's a great question. I will tell you, you can take some tidbits and compare, but we have an interesting topography. You've got Tahoe on one side.
Oh, really? We have an
and that's good. That's always good. But then we're also dealing with a jail and a court services down on this side, as well as up in Auburn. And I think maybe the unique nature of us is we currently have 2 jails that we're running.
Right.
And so that's probably the one that's probably unique in terms of what our counterparts are. I don't know if that, I think that's really a question that we need to have is how do we move forward with that? Because we have other services, we have other programs that we can provide services. Incarceration is just one total option for those that maybe do some bad things or screw up. But that's not the only thing that we have available to
for
us.
similar sized populations, I guess is what I'm looking at is,
Okay.
I know we have interesting cost factors, obviously, but also, I mean, I think we should compare to, through CSAC or whatever. What
Okay.
are, with similar population numbers, how do the medical expenses look? How do the staffing levels look? I mean, given this growth factor,
Right.
if we're gonna best control some of those costs in the future, are there other models out
Okay.
there? Are there things we can do long term? I mean, I'm not.
Yeah. Let's work on it. I think between the sheriff and ourselves, we can
Because
look
they
at
would
some
know a lot about
comparison.
what other areas have done to try to
No
trim
question
those
about
costs
it.
or control those costs and protect their staff.
I will tell you, as an organization, though, having a criminal justice coordinating council that we have established here is critical to talking about other ways to provide criminal justice service or working more collaboratively together, and having the courts involved in that conversation is also another integral part.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right.
The next slide, and this is the last one for public safety, is just kind of a chart to show you where their annual deficit is going to start becoming an issue in the out years. So in 1920, we're projecting just under $1 million shortfall. And that's going to be the same in 2021 based on our projections. But that escalates out to 24-25 of nearly 10 million if all things projected stay the same.
Right.
So same general fund transfer levels, same property tax increases, same sales tax, same expenditure rising. If nothing changes in that model, this is the outlook for the public safety fund.
Right.
So obviously we feel like that's very unsustainable, and coordinating with the sheriff's office to develop some ideas and some plans around how to resolve that before we get there.
Yeah, before we get there, and that's the substance of why I was asking the questions I wasn't about today, but looking out.
And maybe touch on briefly the assumptions we're using about growth, because these are really attributed to how much general fund contribution goes into that fund, as well as obviously what we're projecting for expenses. Do you want to touch on that? Because that gets into regarding, you know, is it just a straight 51% going to them of overall revenues? What is the assumption that we're using to make that?
So for the general fund transfer, the assumption that we've included is still the 51% of general fund contingencies revenues. So not just property tax, but everything that falls into that same revenue category. And there's a whole list of different things that go into that. So you have the property taxes, sales and use tax, hotel motel tax, franchise taxes, investment income, all those different categories are all included in the contingencies. And so right now, the model is reflecting 51% of the budgeted number for that category. So in current year, 19-20, it's about 122 million. And then that reflects 51% of any growth that we've included in for the out years as well. So it just maintains 51%. So as the general fund revenue increases on contingencies, we've increased the transfer to the sheriff's or to the public safety fund as well. Does that make sense?
So the $10 million increase by 2024, 25 is pretty small. Is any of that driven with the building of the minimum security facility and the mental health facility at the South Placer Justice Center, or is that in?
Currently, we don't factor that in, although you did hear the operating costs back in August.
Yeah.
The estimated amount, I believe there was an offset on the mental health unit because we were working with the state, at least because my focus is more about operating costs and the capital. We've kind of covered the capital. This is operating side. I think it's about $275,000 is what we were projecting on the medium security, and that's some offsets that they were doing. Mark. We contracted. So we want to keep that as cost neutral as absolutely possible. I think between talking with the sheriff and his staff and the CO's, we want to make sure you're crystal clear about what those operating costs were. This doesn't factor that in, but in the totality of it, it's honestly a very small amount. Incrementally, it would be the growth of those two items. And in fact, there could be opportunities when we have a mental health unit, we can potentially double bunk areas where we are having people in single bed cells right now. So hopefully we can manage the jail even at a more efficient level than what we can, because we'll have those beds to actually move them into the appropriate, because right now there are mental health folks that probably shouldn't be in the general population, and they're really impacting where we, how we house folks. So there are some opportunities for some savings there. Okay, any other questions about this one? I look at this and say this is the one that we need to just have a more longer term discussion on. Either it's about how much general fund contribution goes to this fund, and maybe come up with more of a policy about, hey, as revenue increases, they will get a portion of that. If it declines or flattens out, they can manage the operation in the same manner. Because as you, and this doesn't really show the prior years, but the escalation of the transfer that we have made from the general fund to the public safety fund has exceeded the revenue percentage growth on an annualized basis over the last 4 years. It was about a little over 10% growth in this general fund transfer to the public safety fund. Our overall revenue increase is less than that. And so one of the conversations that I've preliminarily had with the sheriff is, could we get to a conversation about revenue percentage growth not being greater than the growth of the overall revenue on a given year? So in the event that it's 6% growth, maybe they get 6% increase in general fund transfer. But it's not sustainable that we're sending more, on a percentage basis, more revenue to the public safety fund than the revenue that we're giving in. That's why that's just not a sustainable model. And as the sheriff, and I think we've talked about, he manages this operation very efficiently. But as such, we also want to make sure that he's clear about the revenue component and manages within that, because he also has his vehicles are in there. We gave some additional dollars this last year for that helicopter, which needed to happen. We need to make sure we keep our assets in a well-maintained status, but those are the sort of the things that need to come up, and we want to make sure we have a long-term game plan. So I think we'd like to come back with an idea about this and a recommendation to you, but my general thought is potentially having something that talks more about the revenue percentage growth commensurate with the percentage growth to that public safety fund. Otherwise, it'll just end up continuing to go up pretty significantly based on the current trend of what we've seen the last 4 years.
Right, and so this is assumed a 51% share, so holding the percentage of general fund the same and not seeing that increase, where in fact their costs may be even more than that?
Yeah.
Or are you projecting a balanced?
No.
That they're gonna need more?
You talked to the expense increase.
You know what,
Yeah.
do you understand what I'm saying? Is
Yeah.
that you've held it, you've said it's grown 10% from 41% to 51% of general fund. Now you're saying, looking at these projections, we're keeping it 51%, we're still at a 9.7 million.
Correct. I mean, one of
Yeah.
the things I think that's unique about this is what you saw over the last 4 years and even a few years before that. There were some significant policy issues,
Right.
significant additions to the jail that
And
drove
state
that
mandates.
percent.
And state
state
issues, I mean,
mandates.
drivers that are beyond everybody's control in this room,
Yeah,
so.
and so, obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, but I think some of those big drivers that drove that, we're hoping are not going to be continual trends. There may be some shifting of what are deemed felonies and misdemeanors and all
Right.
that sort of thing, but as a whole, hopefully we've stabilized this a little bit in terms of significant increases.
Okay.
Okay. So moving on, Health and Human Services. So we just have one slide to address Health and Human Services. I'll make some comments about their information here. The 5-year assumptions that we used do include the recently approved capital projects. So the HHS admin building, so all those have factored in here as well. Departmental expenses.
I'm sorry, does
I'm
that
sorry.
include recent direction on Kirby Hills?
Yes.
Kirby Hills as well.
No.
The Kirby
Well,
Hills acquisition?
So as far as departmental expenses go,
Oh, okay. Yeah,
so
yeah.
they are including all their
Okay.
ongoing costs within their expenditure budget and then in their revenue targets as well. So any ongoing maintenance costs, rent, leases, payment costs are already included.
And just to touch on this around Kirby Hills, they're already paying a lease amount.
Right.
We're looking at doing a
Right.
amortization schedule that be commensurate with probably close to what their current lease amount is. So it's kind of been factored in
Yep.
just in a different way.
I got it. Thank
Okay.
you.
So their budget, is pretty balanced. So they reflect their costs to charge out on contracts and intergovernmental programs, along with a general fund contribution that's about $38-39 million per year. Their fund balance projection here starts in fiscal year 18-19. At the close of fiscal year 18-19, there was about a $3.7 million revenue to expense, revenue over expense ending balance. So that fund balance is just projected to carry forward through the out years. We just want to point out that this does not include the mandated reserve of $5 million and does also not include any of their realignment fund balances as well.
Got
So
a question. Based on my age and how long I've been around. I always had it in my head that the local match for HHS was 10%, but the 38 mil would be like twice that.
Mhm.
So am I wrong on my 10% assumption, or?
Yeah,
Depends on the fund, it depends on the program.
Uh-huh.
Some
But
are
overall, it's
80-20
fine.
splits, some are 90-10, some are 60-40.
But overall, it's
Jeff here?
closer to 20?
Closer.
It's 20%.
Yeah.
It's been, well, I've been here 6 years and it's held relatively flat at 20% since I arrived.
Thanks.
It's usually the average of all the different programs.
So that was really the extent of the Health and Human Services Fund, unless there are any questions.
Quick question, so for the ending fund balance, when there's those additional dollars at the end of every year, what do you use those for? What are they used for, or can they be used for?
To revert back to the general fund for covering other needs or other deficits in other departments.
Yeah.
Okay.
So currently, because there is a general fund subsidy to the program, what we have historically and what we've kind of done is true up the fund. So in the event that they don't need the total allocation, we'll send over that allocation, but we're not going to send any more than what is necessary. So it usually just reverts back to the general fund balance. It doesn't come in as a transfer. This also, just so you're aware, this deals with really Kirby Hills, because we kind of build in the lease component. It also deals with the new HHS building, solely for the fact that they have some operating costs that they're paying for right now. And Steve has kind of talked to this a little bit over time. The efficiency of this new building should have an utility offset component to it. So barring any new staff or anything attributed to that, which would be kind of ancillary to the building, but the actual operating cost of the building should be equal to or less than what they're paying now, specifically because we're going to be doing some photovoltaic issues on that, and just the efficiency of the systems that are going to be in place and they're currently not doing. So I think we have honestly, this is a pretty sound fund. Really what's being brought in is what's going out, and we haven't seen significant growth projections, anything anywhere near above what we're seeing revenue growth out of the general fund in terms of the transfer.
Yeah, and just trying to compare apples to apples, I'm looking at approximately 35% increase over these 9 years, so about 3.8% per year.
Correct. Yep.
Just want to make sure my math was right, my little calculator.
Moving forward, our library fund. So the library fund is growing over the years, as the rest of them are as well. And the assumptions that went into this model for the library include maintaining their current fiscal year 1920 general fund transfer, which is just about $1.8 million, and carrying that forward through all the years. So the growth in the revenue that you'll see is mostly on the library property tax side, which has been averaging about 6% growth per year over the last couple of years.
Thanks, Ray. So the assumption is it stays at a fixed dollar amount, not a fixed percent, 1.8 million.
Correct.
Yeah, the growth in this on the revenue side is really all attributed to the property tax growth, because they get a portion of the property tax piece. We've tried to keep it relatively constant, but as you know, they did have a strategic plan. They brought it forward to you. They had some ideas around investments. I've talked with Mary about this. Really, it's this conversation about what, if you're going to make an investment above and beyond the general fund transfer, what operational, how do you either contain the cost, reduce the cost, how do you make it more efficient in terms of the service delivery? And she's really utilized more automation to do that. Jim, you've been to these libraries, and I think she's done some really good things around automation, and she's going to continue that. So right now we're looking at holding her amount constant over time. In the event that there is a request that she has for an infusion of cash from either a technology or service delivery standpoint, we'll have those conversations independently, but it won't be just a consistent increase in growth. You can make that determination. Two things: whether she has the fund balance to support it and utilize her fund balance, because she does have some fund balance, or you'd like to make a one-time general fund contribution towards that project if she doesn't have the necessary capital to support it. So that's kind of how we've handled this fund historically, and I can think going forward, and it still is on trend. It's really a question of, this is we have a current level of service, and there are some libraries that aren't open 40 hours a week.
Right.
And so I think that will be a conversation that we'll have with you, is what is their current service level discussion? Is that something that seems appropriate at this current time? If there is a change of that, then that's something that we need to have a conversation about, because there will be really a staffing cost attributed to that.
What's the percentage of AV or property tax that we're, do you know approximately?
The percentage of their overall revenue that comes in, is that what you're talking about? And
No,
that's-
because you're saying
Growth.
you're just looking at keeping them consistent with their percentage of assessed value. I mean, this is a larger growth than we saw on the just Health and Human Services side, so I mean, those are policy discussions you want us to get to, right, as far as
Correct.
looking at shortfalls in one area and expansion in another, and
Yeah,
They
they're,
have a dedicated amount, right, from property tax,
Right.
and that's where the major growth is.
right.
But that's not all. There are some areas that don't have the library property tax associated with them, are there not?
Correct. If
So
like
this-
Roseville, we're talking AV growth for really unincorporated areas.
The
that have
unincorporated areas.
libraries.
And
So-
what's that percentage that's dedicated to them, do you know? Or you can get it to me later. So that, continuing, you're saying that's 100% of what they're getting is what we're mandated. We don't have a policy discussion on
So
that.
1920 is an estimate of 6.3% growth. For 2021, we're looking at 5%. In the out years, it's 5, 4, and then we kind of narrow it down a little bit, 2%. So those are in the out years of their growth estimates. But that's on a percentage basis. That's what we're seeing growth, which is somewhat consistent with the rest of the
I'm not
county.
asking that. Yeah, I don't think I'm asking the
Okay.
right question. You're saying there's a dedicated portion in unincorporated areas to the libraries.
Correct.
And-
Is that done by policy?
And Rockland.
And Rockland. And that's done by board policy?
Well, Rockland Library is a county library. so-
Yeah.
But
No,
think
but I
what she's
mean-
asking
Depends
is
on-
how was that
The
fund,
amount.
how was that property tax established? How was that?
isn't that voter
That
approved?
assessment.
Yeah, was
So-
it voter approved, Andy?
Back in Prop 13, yeah.
Yeah.
So it was the percentage that was going in Prop 13 elevated forward. So there really isn't a policy decision the board can make to.
Not on that component.
Not on that.
That's
To
why-
change
that's why
that
we- yeah,
component.
that's why
We
we've
could always
had the
enhance
general
but
fund.
not take away.
Correct.
Okay.
Right, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I asked it better then. Sorry.
And the way you do it is through the general fund transfer
Yeah.
amount would be adjusted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So my only other comments on this slide is you can see in budget 2019-20 a drop in fund balance down to about $500,000. That was budgeted as a cancellation of reserves to support the operations. We're projecting that's not going to happen or not going to be needed in the fiscal year, so we've propped back up their ending fund balance to about $1.4 million, and then kind of sustaining that relatively same number out through the out years based on the assumptions that we used. In the expenditures also, I just want to note that we did include some capital and technology expenses in the out years as well. Kind of mirrors or mimics the strategic plan that was just recently adopted for the library. So we've tried to meet some of those objectives in the planning for their budget in the out years.
So that's already included in, yeah.
That's on that. So just to kind of summarize that, the library receives funding two major sources: the library property tax. Just a note that it's been increasing about 6% per year over the last 5 years. And then the general fund transfer has been stable. Our 5-year model assumes the appropriation remaining flat at the $1.8 million, which we've already discussed. Okay. And moving off the library, the capital fund. So we're going to address the capital fund and the road fund later a little differently because they're not treated the same in the other operating funds. So the majority of the expenses in capital are related to projects in the capital improvement plan, and they all have corresponding revenues and expenditures to meet those project expenses and costs. The costs are budgeted annually, 100% of the project expense. The long-term budget perspective is going to be determined by the projects that we take on, and then all the identifiable funding sources for those projects. So nothing will come into the plan, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, unless it has a funding source specifically designated to it and only to that project. The general fund impact from the capital fund is where the decision is made by the board to utilize general fund or capital reserves to fund a project. So allocating $20 million or $18.6 million for the HHS admin building or Burton Creek projects and things like that. That's where the general fund gets impacted. Just a snapshot of the fund balance as of the end of fiscal year 18-19. They have the contingency fund balance of $685,000, committed fund balance of 1.8, and $18.8 million of unassigned fund balance. The unassigned fund balance is a collective, basically, of all the funds they've received from various sources to fund the projects that are in their capital plan. The reason it sits in the unassigned category instead of restricted or committed is for quicker response to access those funds, and without having to go through the process of canceling reserves and then recognizing that revenue and then making the expenditure. This allows them quicker access to the funds that we need to move forward on a specific project at any point in time. So that's the difference there. But all this is really spoken for in projects that have already been identified and are on path for completion and construction. Any questions on capital funds so far? Okay. The next slide, sorry, the small print on this one. This is the breakdown of the capital fund budget for fiscal year 19-20. You can see that we're projected to spend about $74 million. And then here's the outline of all the sources of those funds. So $14.3 million is coming from the general fund, and that is spread out over major maintenance and rehab projects, the coroner facility, the elections warehouse, the NAHAS property acquisition, energy conservation project, park projects, and some overhead funding. And then you can see the other funding sources that balance out that expenditure budget with park dedication fees, capital facilities, infrastructure fees, fund balance, use of reserves, and the like. And so their balanced capital budget at $74 million.
This is the fund that has a lot of, we budget in the general fund, transfer it over to the capital fund. This is that transfer conversation that's taking place, but this is really where we're paying for all our capital related items.
Okay. So moving on, the road fund.
Question.
Oh, yeah.
Talked about the policy with regards to depreciation. So just personal comment, I hate deferred maintenance, but how closely we look at that by asset, I think is very important. So as we accumulate the depreciation on our aging assets, do we do any reconciliation as to this with that countywide? Obviously, there are a multitude of assets throughout various departments. So is there any drilling down into looking, are we really setting aside reserves appropriately to replace and or upgrade assets of all types and nature and colors and expression appropriately?
So I think in general, there's a couple things here. One is the general fund's been making an annual contribution for the Placer County Government Center and for major rehab projects. I think that number is about $4.5 million a year. So that's to address some of that infrastructure needs and different things like that. The board and at final budget adoption, if you remember, we placed some additional funds into the capital reserve under the general fund. So it's not switching over here for a pre-approved project yet, but funds are being set aside for those specific issues in the out years. So we're accumulating a capital reserve to use for the acquisitions, but also to address any deficiencies in any of the current buildings that we have as well.
Yeah, I'm talking about all of our assets. So, like the helicopters, for example, we had a big expenditure that went. So if you buy this helicopter, it's got an estimated useful life of something,
Right.
10, 20 years. I mean, aircraft, stay around forever, but they keep replacing parts at a pretty quick rate, particularly after the first 5 years. So,
Yeah.
are we reconciling? So I'm assuming that in the operating budget, there's a cost of maintaining and operating that helicopter. There should also be a depreciation component for replacing the components as that becomes necessary. But we should be doing that for our fleets
For all of our
Yeah,
assets.
So,
Okay.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so you mentioned fleet, so that is part of the fleet charge in the ISF pattern is to collect a replacement cost. So when those vehicles are up for replacement, there's dollars accumulated for that purchase as well. I think we're going to be looking at some of our other funds, or other equipment outside of fleet, so road fund and some of the heavy equipment that they utilize, that's going to be falling off the CARB requirements for usefulness in the future, and how to fund those replacements. So those are bigger expenditures, obviously. Specifically to the helicopter, I don't know that I have an answer for that, but
I'm just
look
saying,
to
I
Mark
asked
to
about
pitch in.
the status of our road conditions every single year as a matter of behavior, so I'll be doing that again as we.
Okay.
But I think the whole idea of the depreciation set aside and put aside so that we have those reserves available when whatever the facility is or equipment is replaced. So having that set aside, especially in times when we are, as we just did with the transfer, it wasn't necessarily based on what we needed, it was what we had available, and so we moved it. But where is that trend line? Did we need 10 million put over and we put in 4.5, or did we need 2 and we put in 4.5?
Yeah.
Those are kinds of schedules I'm used to looking at for asset replacement values. So.
Great question. And actually one that's really important, because it's one we've actually talked about individually the last, probably last month. And Andy and myself, we had a really good and pretty frank discussion about this, and so I asked him to do some really an audit, an internal audit of what our fleet and replacement plans are, not only for fleet but for just the road equipment as well. So he was kind enough to do that, and I think he recognized that, hey, we need to, if we prioritize, we pay for our debt, we pay for our contracts, we pay for preventative maintenance, and then if we have other things that we can spend on. But we don't not do preventive maintenance and increase service level.
Right.
I think it's just, and you wouldn't do that in your own personal household. So we want to shore that up. So we'll be back in touch.
For the board, I think, we're obviously not going to be contemplating every piece of equipment that we have throughout every organization, but it's easy to mask policy questions to us if we think we have more money than we actually do over the long run, because we're not taking care of the stuff that we have.
Totally agree.
Exactly.
So I think that's the key driver for when you're up in our
i.e.
place.
the domes.
Well, we want to, maybe that's another one. But, smoothing out the cost, and you see vehicles, you don't want big giant swings in a given year, because you're looking for, I think the helicopter, I would say, was a good example of that. We had a significant expenditure that came up. We probably should have been building up a reserve over time to allow for that. So when it's needs that major investment, we've already accounted for that.
Right.
So we'll be doing that and coming back to that. I think that was a thing that Andy and I committed to, and I think that's a good thing for us.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Otherwise we'd have no dumps.
The next one is our road fund. So I don't have much to talk about here, except for the road fund's receiving a general fund transfer of about $3.8 million a year. We have a maintenance of effort that the general fund needs to maintain in order to keep receiving the new SB1 gas tax dollars, and so essentially we would suggest at this point maintaining that going into the near future anyways, or at least through the next fiscal year, just to keep maintaining that and receiving our SB1. Any questions on the road fund?
No problem.
Offer that one.
Yeah, on SB, well, going back, the projections on SB1, could I get those when you have a chance as far as what our revenues look like in that fund? And the same thing on,
But I'd like
I'm
to
having a
see-
lot of complaints about roads.
I'd like to see a breakdown of where we're spending those SB1 funds, so people ask us, because with this state government fiasco,
Mhm.
we need to be able to clarify and to let people know exactly where those funds are spent. So
Yeah.
if you can bring that to me or, and.
Right.
the
Maybe to
staff.
all of us,
We'll
that would
just,
be
we'll
great.
just give it to all.
And that condition of roads
We'll send it,
analysis, because, yeah, you're gonna overspend in one, or it might look like you're spending in one area, but those roads may not have been replaced in 60 years, and now you need to.
Delineate where the funds are.
I think part of SB1 requires that monies are spent on specific projects that are approved by the board as well, and
Yeah.
that gets submitted to the state.
Right.
Also, that's a portion of the gas tax dollars, not all of it, and then there's the more discretionary spending. But we can certainly put all that information together for you.
That would be
Sure.
great, yeah.
Okay, and the last fund is the fire fund, and again, a brief presentation on this one is just really showing the use of fund balance beginning in 18-19 all the way down out through 24-25, where there will be no more fund balance left to sustain the growth and the operational costs in that fund. We did some work on all the individual fire funds that are associated with this, but this slide focuses just on the fire protection fund in general, and this receives a flat general fund allocation. I think it's $1.1 million a year, the current level. So
again, this is a conversation we've had for a while. Looks like there is a time period to make some adjustments here, but absent this, and let me just talk to you, all these funds, whether we're the fire fund or anything else, they aren't going to go negative. We're not going to have these funds go negative. It just doesn't work. So the only thing that has to happen is there ends up being a general fund contribution. We're not showing that we're going to be putting more money in to make this fund whole. It's staying under certain current scenarios. So unless there is additional revenue, then ultimately there would have to be an expense reduction. And it's pretty straightforward. But it is a conversation that we had. And I think for the two between Supervisor Holmes and Gustafson on the ad hoc committee, this gives you a time frame for what we're looking at in terms of the fund. We want to maybe work on the financial piece, because I think it's fair for citizens to know the condition of this fund and the services are provided for fire service, and this just isn't a sustainable model, and
Right.
everybody knows it. We're just at a point where we need to take some action in this, and this gives you the time frame of when that may be.
Right, and does this include the equipment and the buildings? Or this is just the operating?
Includes equipment, but again, we want to make sure that we have a replacement schedule.
Right.
That we're not just buying it when it comes up.
They're
that
not
we
cheap.
Build it in. No, they aren't cheap.
And
On
they're not
the
cheap.
building side, I would.
Is that in the facilities budget or in Steve or?
I would say we do
stations?
not have that dialed in very well. I know, and Steve, maybe you can talk to this, but I know we have money that's, we've been looking at what the condition is, so
Right.
what would it take to
Mhm.
enhance these, and some have a couple $1 million of renovations. Those are not factored into this fund.
Right.
And this was part of the conversation when we had the financial consultant, Goodwin, doing the fiscal analysis on this fund. The totality of all fire-related services,
Right.
whether it's equipment, buildings, operations, and maintenance, all need to be factored in the whole
Absolutely, yep. Yep.
component. So I would say the buildings themselves are not factored in here.
Right, and so I think then that deficit grows, or that fund balance contribution grows. So just making sure we're clear on that.
Yep. Okay.
So that is the end of the conditions of our funds, of our major operating funds presentation. And before we move into budget development policies for the next fiscal year, offer the board a break or an opportunity to ask more questions about anything we've covered so far.
We'll take 5?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take 5. Start. All right, so we're coming back. We're going to talk about 2021 more specifically here, kind of the lead up to the budget development process. So we kind of work on, I call them targets, different terms, but kind of the starting point for each department. So what I've asked Daniel and his staff to do is kind of walk through what are some key foundational things that we would like to start with for this 2020 year, and get some feedback from you about, do you agree, concur with that, at least for a starting point as we lead the year off. So Dan, you want to take it?
Okay, so as Todd mentioned, we shortly after we adopted our final budget on September 24th began the budget development process for fiscal year 2021. So I think they had about a 20-minute break or so.
All right, well, at least a day off.
Yeah. And so we've been kind of going through the preliminary pieces of that so far. So we've been working on setting the new targets for salary and benefits costs and inputting the drivers into that, as well as starting to work with our internal service funds and creating their base budgets, which I believe we gave them the go-ahead last night to go ahead and start doing their budget development and bring those back to us in about a month. So we're at a point now where we'll be looking to roll out the entire base budget process to our departments here in the next month and a half or so. And before we do that, we wanted to touch on a couple ideas and policy decisions for the board to help us with that we can do before we roll those budgets out to kind of help smooth the process a little bit, make it a little bit cleaner, and get out in front of that so we don't have to try to adjust it later as the departments have spent time developing their budgets and things. So I'm going to walk through a couple different scenarios, or 4 different ideas. One is going to be the fund transfer. So kind of everything that we talked about before the break and how much the general fund is transferring to any of these major operating funds, and get some board feedback on maintaining levels or doing something a little bit different, but kind of get out in front of that. We're going to talk about the base budget, again, setting some rules around our base budget development. We'll touch on vacancy savings, and then finally we'll want to talk about unfunded allocations. So we'll walk through each of these things individually and go from there. So this slide is really just kind of a summary of what we talked about previously. These are the 7 funds, how much of a general fund transfer they were receiving in the 2019-20 budget process, and what kind of made up that number. So you can see for public safety is $122.4 million for this year, and that's based on 51% of the general fund contingencies revenue budget. So I think we've covered that already. HHS, it was budgeted for $39,383,000, and that varies depending on their needs and our needs, and where we have room to increase or decrease based on new initiatives and different things like that. The library is flat at 1.8 million. Road fund again flat at 3.7. The capital varies. You saw that through the budget process that we do contribute 4.5 for Placer County Government Center maintenance projects, and as well as any additional contributions for major property acquisitions or building construction, things like that. And then our fire fund again at about $1.1 million has been a flat contribution.
And just as perspective, what is the CAL FIRE contract annually? So like 12, 14?
13 or 14? Yeah, 13. Yeah.
How much?
Just over
13.
13?
Thanks.
Just under 13?
So that's where we began fiscal year 1920. Now we're at a point where in developing our base targets and things like that, whether we should maintain our current level of general fund contribution and support to these funds, or looking at modifying that to upon board direction, doing things a little bit differently. But our recommendation at this point would be for the road fund, library fund, and fire protection, maintain the current level of support for those three. They are three flat allocate or appropriations, and we can adjust through the budget development process for any one-time needs that they have, any new capital expenditures or other things that pop up during the budget development process. And for health and human services and public safety funds, again, we would just recommend at this point kind of maintaining our current allocation or appropriation process, address any one-time needs that come in, and make those adjustments as we go. The first part of today's workshop is showing you the condition of the funds. Will hopefully set the stage for the discussions on how to make these changes in the future. We could starting with fiscal year 2021 or going further out, but showing the condition in the ending fund balances and the deficits in any of those major funds. If there should be discussion up front, then we'd like to have that now. So going into base budget establishment, we can modify that or modify our approach. So that is our discussion point around fund transfers, and open it up to Todd or the board for any comments or questions.
Any thoughts about that or approach? I know this is it's a bigger kind of a bigger topic. I know as I had said, I think any growth that we have in fund transfers shouldn't be greater than the growth that we're seeing in revenue on a percentage basis. Is that something that is worth you to have some interest in exploring, because it's a little different than what we had. I mean, a little different than this normal 51% sort of thing. We know kind of what their current transfer has been. What would be going forward is what would be a growth factor off of that amount that they currently have. So the transfer is approximately, and I'm just talking public safety, is about $122 million. I'd be talking more about, is there a percentage growth factor greater than $122 million, and it would commensurate with what our estimated growth factor would be revenue versus a straight 51%. There's some similarities. The dollar amounts aren't going to deviate too much, but
well, even if you start at that, we complete the budget and then we look at what we have, and if the needs and priorities change, then we have the opportunity to add more. But that's a good threshold, I think, for planning purposes, right? I mean, your recommendation, but then if there is,
there's
something.
going to be one-time items that come up. That helicopter is a great example of something that
Poor
came up.
helicopter.
Pick
on something
and not to pick
else.
on it. I'm not picking on it. I think it's a good example of these things that come up through the course of the year that really weren't known.
Right.
We just need to be cognizant of that. That would be my only take.
Yeah, and I think as a guiding, trying to base it on what we see as revenue, new revenue, and then the expenses is a good guideline, so that we can set policy then on additional revenue that we have, if we are fortunate to continue the trend of having additional revenue beyond that too.
And just so you're clear.
Because we're behind in other areas. Obviously, we've just been talking about depreciation, so we're underfunded there, so then we can start talking about setting aside those reserves,
So,
right?
yeah, I think, yeah, I'm concur with the 51 kind of target, but the way I think I'm thinking about it, my strongest reaction right now is that, essentially we're supposed to be talking about our policy direction to you. So I'm thinking of these things in terms of short-term versus long-term policy. And I think the key driver on the long-term side should always be what is the right size of the budget, and actually, the rest shouldn't matter, because it's kind of like there's that engineering thing on the roads that I've forgotten the name of that I ask about every year. But we're supposed to be maintaining our roads at a particular percentage of, because over the long run, that's the cheapest way to maintain our roads. And there have been times like 2008 where I know Yolo County has actually taken paved roads and converted them to gravel because they decided from a policy perspective that that was a better allocation of the resources that they had available. And they didn't have the resources that we had. So it's a lot cheaper to maintain those roads. I'm sure they got some feedback from their constituents on that.
Goat trails are even cheaper.
Yeah. So
Covered
I'm looking at the 51% as kind of being breaks on what have been extraordinary increases in those costs, largely state-driven. The realignment fiasco and the leadership in the state of California sort of nauseates me every day when I come to work. But so we have also talked about, in the long run, trying to offset those costs through more enlightened management and probation and HHS and jails and sheriff and DA and the courts. So to me, that's where we should go first in terms of policy, and then the numbers should follow that in a perfect world, but then we have to do the best we can under the circumstances and the constraints that we have. And then sometimes, like in 2008, we quit funding. I supported discontinuing any contributions to the open space reserve, as much as that's been a soft spot in my heart. But compared to public protection, it was a luxury priority as compared to more of an essential priority.
Okay.
So in the context of, again, the 51% being kind of an effort to put on some brakes in an area that has been extremely concerning in terms of its consumption of the general fund contribution, then I think it's a good strategy, I guess, a tactic by which to.
And again, this is kind of the starting point. This is what we'd start with the budget.
Right.
But we wanted to kind of lay down a foundation to kind of start with, and then obviously do things. Jim, did you have something?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the Fire Protection Fund.
Okay.
I know the CEO's office under Becky's leadership is working closely with our Placer County Fire Chief to find efficiencies in how that service delivery model is moving forward. And then Supervisor Gustus and I are trying to find a method to make more efficient with the zones of benefits. And it may be prudent to add some more to the Fire Protection Fund as we move forward until we get to where we need to be, so we don't have to contribute to from the general fund. Just ideas, and we're going to need some. It's going to be a heavy lift in order to consolidate those zones of benefits, but I think we may need some extra dollars in there in order to achieve that goal.
Are you thinking ongoing dollars, or are you talking about one-time money for a?
Yeah, probably one-time money. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to work through kind of this process. in
Yeah, the
general?
process, and we're going to have to
Okay.
go out and talk to the constituents about explaining how they need to step up as far as their contribution, but we're going to have to spend some dollars as far as if we go out for a parcel tax increase, something of that nature.
Okay.
And that's why we need to see that whole picture of facilities, the buildings, the stations, as well as the equipment and the operating fund, to make sure that we know how much the total investment is at some point too.
Okay.
But I know we're working with a consultant separately on those
Yeah.
issues to put it together. But
Here's my thought here is we may carve out a little money, so we won't send, when we do the budget allocation, we carve out a few dollars here, what we think, and once we get that financial analysis back from Goodwin, which will probably be, I think, February, March-ish, We can come back when we have further discussions with you and say, hey, do you want to put in maybe this one-time infusion to get us through some of these after we know the totality of it? Would that be I mean, I think it kind of meets your needs. I just don't know what the magnitude of that dollar infusion would be at this point.
What you mean by a few dollars?
My guess is probably a million or two is probably what I'm.
That's comfortable.
Okay. But that may be
Yeah.
3
Just
years
yeah,
utilizing
right.
those dollars or something.
Right.
You okay with that?
Yeah, I don't really know right now what the net is,
Right.
but I think in general, we don't want to see a growth in operational costs during this time. Because if we continue to move in that direction, then there's less incentive for people to
Right.
really understand the value of what we're doing for a select group, so,
Yeah. All right.
yeah.
Okay. Let me see what I can put together, but I hear
Yeah.
kind of the point about that.
Yeah.
Okay. HHS, just generally, obviously their growth is fairly commensurate with the growth in our revenue, so I don't think that's inconsistent, and it sounds like, they're positioned fairly well, so unless there's anything you'd like to deviate from that, we'll kind of keep the same trajectory.
Mhm.
All right.
So kind of maintaining on the public safety side, the 51% target that we currently use, and then addressing either one-time or ongoing cost increases. I'd just throw the ongoing in there for the public defender costs,
Mhm.
which we're expecting they're going to rise perhaps significantly in the near future, and how those are monitored in there, but those can be discussed as separate items and bring them forward in discussion on the whole budget package, if that's good.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, the next one is our balanced budget, and the idea or the concept here of, I heard the term, what's the right size? This might help us kind of drive out what the right size budget is in the future. And so past practice has been really utilizing the carryover fund balance and budgeting, including that number for the new year. This concept or this policy decision point would be to not budget carryover fund balance as an ongoing budgetary expense, but utilize it really for the one-time purchases, capital assets, or to address specific technology needs or things like that occur in the budget process, but really developing a base budget that aligns with the new year's revenue targets and creating a base budget starting from that point, and then address these ongoing or these one-time needs as we go through. This is a big lift for us to take on. We'd obviously like doing this before we release base budgets to all the departments, and to do that, we would be looking at pretty much one of two options, which is in-house in the CEO's office doing an analysis, identify what the real actuals have been, and recommend and make those changes before we release the base budgets to the departments, and obviously communicate with them and work with them throughout the process to make sure we're not taking something out that really is structural to their budget needs, but really kind of bringing that back down to the real numbers for the next fiscal year. The simpler, more broad stroke would be to do a countywide reduction target, and I don't like that idea for a couple reasons. One, any departments that are really budgeting to that line could be negatively impacted by that broad brush, and it doesn't really create for us an accurate accounting of our line items or our budget ledgers that we would probably be looking for in here to see where we really are spending the money that we're budgeting. So our recommendation, with the board's agreement, would be to take a look at this pre-base budget delivery and have CEO analysts really work through this budget process and identify where we have opportunities to essentially right-size the expenditure budget for 2021.
So along those lines, have we given any thought to taking all of our departments, breaking them down into, say, 5 groups? When you break down the budget, say these 5 different groups approximate roughly 20% of the overall budget. And on a 5-year rotational basis, obviously not having to go through the exercise every year, but on a 5-year rotational basis, have every department break down every one of the services provided and start at zero and say, why are we providing this service? Do we still need to provide this service? And are we providing it in the fashion that's most efficient based on changes in technology, based on changes in mandates, whatever the case may be? Just zero-based budget, every department on a rolling basis, on a 5-year basis, so that it forces every department to be able to justify each dollar and not say, we're starting from where we finished last year and we anticipate additional revenues to be 4% next year, higher than last year, and so that's what we're going to anticipate our expenditures being, and really break this thing down on a per department, per function basis.
One of the benefits to, obviously, to zero-based budgeting, like Kirk's talking about, is then as you look at changes in technology, I know that staffing levels can change.
Right.
I mean, and you can be more, I mean, we talked, and when we go back to our priorities, and way down the list, we looked at technology, was way down the list, but the way, at least when I was working in local government, we saw that technology.
You still are.
Well, in a different capacity. When I was actually doing what they're doing, we were able to recognize savings in staffing levels because of technological changes, and so we could budget for the technology. We could get there with technology, but it made other choices hard. I mean, there were times we didn't replace positions because now we had more technology to do that with. So you don't have to budget separately, and that is a benefit of zero-based budgeting, and it's hard for staff, it's hard for all of us but if you can do it with a planned procedure as people depart, because that is the biggest part of our budget is the people, and making sure that we put that into place. And there's places where technology works and you can't replace everybody with technology, but there are some that you can, and you can find those budgets.
Just the functions, the services themselves.
Right.
The board in
Right.
98 might have decided this was a good service for us to provide,
Right.
and we're still providing it, but does it make sense for us to be providing this
Right,
service today?
right.
And just break each individual department down and say, do we want to be in this business? And if we want to be in this business, are we providing that service in the most cost-effective manner possible? With county employees or with contractors? What makes the most sense to look at? Why are we doing it, and how much are we spending to do it?
And then I'm going to add on to that too, and then what are the new services that are out there that people are, the expectations right now, certainly in portions of our county, are we need more money in forest fuels management, and how are we helping people take care of their properties, and what are the other services that they want to protect their homes and their families. And so we can't get to that discussion if we haven't really looked at what we're doing that maybe we don't need to do anymore, or not at the same level. And so it could be a reduction in staffing, or it could be an increase, but with different expertise or different types of services we're providing with those same people. So I think those are.
Let me throw out a proposal here, because I think it's, that obviously that's a big shift that you're throwing out. What if we took one or two, and I can work on which ones those are, and take, say, 2 departments and do a test case for this coming year on how that process would work. Everybody's like, don't make eye contact with them. Don't make eye contact.
Steve's
One, because I do think, I will say, that is a fairly heavy lift, just because that's a total change in mindset.
That's why he said every 5 years.
It absolutely is. And that's why I'm saying break it down, but the full implementation of the first group of departments wouldn't be next year. We would have to determine the evaluative criteria that we're using for making these kinds of decisions, and whether that's the fully contained within the CEO's office making that criteria, or it comes back to the board, to say, how do you want us to proceed when we find these things where we believe that through alternative service delivery methods, we could achieve significant savings and still deliver a high quality level of service. However, this is going to trigger a reopener with our agreements with our union. Does the board want to do that? You know, I think that we've got to start asking the questions.
Sure.
Are we still providing the services that?
Okay.
In the most efficient, effective way
Right.
we can, right?
Okay.
And so I mean, at least that's my perspective is, you know, trying to make sure that we're transparent to our public. This is what we're doing and how we're doing it and why. And if you want more or less, here's what's going to sacrifice. Because I think all too often it's easy, especially when we release a headline of $1 billion budget, for people to look at us and say, well, then why are you asking me for more money?
Right.
You know, why can't you do this? And you know, it's just a little bit. But when you take everything together, and so you know, if you can look at least
Okay.
one department.
Let me,
see.
and talk about a process, what that would look like.
Any volunteers?
And maybe,
Departments
and
that
actually
volunteer?
here, maybe you even make it, I mean, because just like we've done with the Idea Accelerator, you know, you do that for, if you come up with a new way to do something and it's actually saving money, you don't lose all that funding, but there's some incentive to do that
Do that.
and to work with you to find other things the department does want.
Okay.
You know, I mean, that's how all managers should be, but it is hard when you're asking people to do things in a different way.
Sure.
So, any ideas like that you have too?
Okay.
Sorry.
Am I to assume that we wouldn't start with the Board of Supervisors office?
Start with the board of supervisors.
I was gonna say,
There are plenty of
set
things we
it.
do. I wonder why we do them.
Well, you set the tone by starting at the top. Set the tone for it by starting with CEO and board.
Let me come back with a concept or
Yeah.
maybe an idea that we can
Yeah.
get into on.
And
Okay.
I just would add that, so I support your first option, which is more accurate budgeting as it relates to the reserves, getting rid of the reserves essentially. But it connects directly to what Cindy and Kirk are saying, which I also support, which is, but the devil is in the details. So you don't want to tell every department head, come back, you know, you're assuming you have no money. But we want to have mechanisms in place that cause them to think through that. Are we doing the services that the board has prioritized? And in probably the vast majority of cases in the county, we don't have any choice.
Right.
We're the subdivision of the state
Absolutely.
of California.
And it's
But
actually how we provide them.
but so then, the second one is how do we provide those? And creating a culture that more strongly emphasizes that. I mean, I think we've done a lot of good things over the years, like our 5-year budgeting and some other things that have been helpful. The reserve thing always made me crazy, but in doing that, it needs to be very surgical because there'll be a cultural change here that I think the county exec's office needs to work really closely with the department heads to make sure that somebody doesn't get injured or somebody just gets sideways in the circumstance.
Sure.
Because it's good. It's a change in philosophy and a mindset, but it takes us closer to what Kirk and Cindy just articulated.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know, and just to touch on that first, I don't know, indentation there, you know, there's a couple things going on here. One, we're going to talk about it in the next slide or two regarding vacancy savings. So I just simplistically, I break down a budget. There's personnel, there's kind of operating costs, and then there's indirect charges. Internal service funds charge each other or charge departments for services. We have, you know, those sort of things. Those are kind of fixed. That's just the cost of doing business, kind of overhead piece. The personal services, absent saying, do we need this sort of staff? Those are, we know what those general costs are. We have a general idea, and we will factor in vacancy savings to account to get a little more of the actuals. So then it really just comes down to the operating, that third bucket. And you know, what we're really asking on this group is, you know, let's do some, not surgical look, but where do we see that our budget is not reflective of our actual spending pattern?
Yes.
And that is really what, it's not about taking money away from departments, about providing services. It's what's your current service level, and let's budget appropriately for that. And we have contingencies, and we have contingencies and funds, because and you know, and I think this is a testament to you all and to departments when they come and ask you for something, and it's valid and you've contemplated, in most cases, you have fund that request if the funding is there. So I like this approach that, hey, if there is a need, people will ask for it. But we shouldn't be building up contingencies in individual departments for, because we already have a contingency in the funds. And so this is what this is getting, just a better alignment with our budget to actual spending pattern. That's all that we're talking about. And I, is that kind of the thought that some of you had?
I would agree. And you're right, it is a huge change for staff and how you budget. And we went through this process at the city, and it was a whole different way at looking at how we were going to budget. And staff were legitimately concerned that they were going to lose personnel or additional funds to take care of their operations, whatever it was. And it was a whole lot better than saying we're going to cut 10% or 5% off the top. That doesn't work, I don't think, because different departments run at different efficiencies. But what it did allow us to do was it allowed us to save some dollars. And then we had a pot of money, and people could come back halfway through the year and say, you know what, I need those dollars for X, Y, and Z, and we had the money available. And it really allowed us to be a whole lot more efficient with the dollars that we had. And after the first year of, oh God, this is awful, and it was very difficult, but it did allow us to get to a place where we had additional dollars that then we could fund bigger projects or capital projects. And I felt like we really did get to true up the budget. And using those vacancy rates, as we'll talk about, allowed us to do that as well.
Okay.
And the first year is always the hardest. I know when we went to zero-based budgeting, and there's just has to be a huge amount of trust and belief in the people that are stewarding the funds that we are going to be open to that and honor those requests, because that it is a change. So.
Okay.
I mean, I want to have the flexibility when
Yeah.
something comes up and we need the money for a certain project. I don't want to have to say no. I want to be able to easily say we've got those dollars, we can do that.
Okay. Well, we'll work on something in that vein,
Yeah.
kind of the thought. At least, and like I said, again, this is what we'd be starting with departments having a budget. They may be asking for things above and beyond that.
Yeah.
But it gives you the ability to make that decision at that point.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the next one, in kind of the same light, is the salary savings, or the budgeting of for salary savings. Our county's been averaging nearly 8% annual vacancy savings. The current 1920 budget includes a 4% salary savings estimate in there. Again, it's producing a budget that is truer to actual year-end costs. So we recommend, again, maintaining that same level, 4% for the 2021 proposed budget, just to recognize that we do achieve those salary savings at the end of the fiscal year.
And, and just like we just briefly talked about, not every department has an 8% vacancy savings. Some have 10 or 15, and some have 1 or 2, and some don't have any. Usually the smaller departments may not have as much turnover, but that's just a natural course of an organization of this size. And so this isn't abnormal. We're just trying to get a better reflection of our actual spending pattern. And when personal services are 60 to 7% of the budget, that percentage is a sizable amount, and that's what you see many times. A large year-end savings we have is really attributed to just the vacancy and turnover and that sort of thing, and then the recruitment process. So this approach we've done for a number of years is still something that we're relatively interested in continuing down that path. Okay.
Okay, so the next topic is what we refer to as unfunded positions or unfunded allocations. So an unfunded position essentially is a position at some point was allocated to a department in a specific classification, and currently does not have a funding source to it, and it's become unfunded in that sense, but it remains on the approved allocation list that the board approves with the final budget every year. So I'll go through some slides on kind of the numbers around this, But our feeling at this point is the process to fill an unfunded position really is going to be the same as filling a new position allocation, which is a request to Human Resources for the classification and a request to CEO's office identifying the funding source available, whether that's revenue contingent, or if it's grant contingent, or if it's fee driven, or what the limits are to that funding for that position. The transition to Workday position management, which we're working on now, we think it would be cleaner at this point to not carry over those unfunded positions into the new system with us. So for a couple reasons, we're recommending removing them from the 2021 budget process. So the 1920 position allocation that was approved by the board included 2,912 allocated positions. Only 2,669 of those were funded. So that's 243 positions out of the 2,912 that are spread throughout the county that are just sitting on an allocation list as an unfunded position. So those are the positions that we're talking about. There are other positions that are vacant, obviously, and we account for some vacancy savings in our budget process. And those are positions that the departments have the allocation for and the funding source for, and are in some process of either holding them or recruiting for them or filling them in some manner. So we're not talking about making any adjustments to what they already have as far as funded vacancies, but we're looking really at eliminating these unfunded positions from the position management system going forward. So that is just a conversation or a request from your CEO staff to kind of clean up that allocation list. From the optics to the community, I don't know what's better or worse, but for point of discussion, you have 2,912 allocated, but you've only funded 2,669, and I think there's about 2,600 that are filled or that aren't vacant. You're looking at, are we doing more with less? I think the same argument could be made that if we reduce the total allocation by this 243 number, we're still doing more with less. And as long as we're not handcuffing the departments from making their new position requests through the process and allocating them with, like you said, the ability to fund them and to identify the needs and the services that they're going to provide, I think that this item is a good move for us for the allocation model. So now I'll turn it over for any comments and questions.
Would this make it more difficult for the departments if they needed a position to come to the board and ask for that position, since the position's already allocated now? How would that work?
So if the board approves this allocation at final budget time and at the proposed budget, if a department has a request to fill a vacancy, so a classification or a position that is funded and already on the books, they would just make that request through county staff to fill that and then go through the recruitment process. If for some reason a department had a need for a new vacancy or a new position, and there was not a way to make that out of their vacancies that they already have, where you could take two lower level positions and create a higher level or something like that, and we needed to increase the allocation, then that would need to come back to have the allocation reapproved.
That would be approved by the board.
Yeah.
Because that unfunded position would have to get approval for funding anyway.
Right.
Right. It doesn't change.
It
It really doesn't sound like a change.
It would go to you as a board, whether it's
Unfunded or unallocated, okay.
Yeah.
Does it trigger anything, civil service, civil service, do they have to chime in on when you're creating a new allocation? Is there any requirement that this go through civil service at all?
I don't believe that the Civil Service Commission entertains
As long as it's
creating
an allocation
vacancies.
of an existing.
The job description already
classification
exists.
Right.
and range and everything.
So we're not adding an additional step if you simply make the unfunded positions that are allocated, you make those go away, and then at some point in the future, somebody says, I need another widget maker. They come to the board and ask for funding for a widget maker, and we fund and allocate the position at the same time.
Exactly.
It's not an additional step. I'm fine with that.
There's an additional step. this comes up as an issue just because we moved to Workday, and we have a position control module that we're plugging in all these positions, and it's looking and saying, there's no budget for these people. And so we're kind of have to, not Jimmy rig it, but we got to work on it to get these unfunded in. So it just makes sense. Let's just be clean about the ones we're funding, and
think
if you
that
need
makes sense.
something,
Yeah.
ask for it. Okay.
The request here, in addition to being able to do that, would be to make that a countywide direction, and all departments with any unfunded positions would be swept and cleared off before we move into the new budget year. So that was the request there. Moving into our fiscal year 2021 development timeline. And before I go into that, I'd just entertain the board's conversation or input on any other budget development ideas or topics that we may not have covered that you can think of. Otherwise, we'll kind of show you what we're anticipating for our high-level budget development cycle. Okay. So here's your high-level budget timeline. Today, we're here doing a budget workshop, and I think it's been productive so far. In March 2020, we'll be coming to the board, or the departments will be presenting their items to you again, just like they did this last year in the March-April timeframe. The exact dates are to be determined pending your board adopting your board calendar next week. So we'll fill these in later, but these are the items or the times where we'll be coming back to the board for review or input and discussion on any of the proposed budget items. So that would occur in March, which is on the same schedule as we are currently. The big change to this, or the proposed change, is making a final budget adoption in June rather than September. And doing that over 2 board meetings in June. One board meeting would be the public hearing to entertain the budget, and then coming back, I think 2 weeks later, and making the final budget adoption. Again, if that's a timeline that the board concurs with, we'll be coming back and updating the dates that those things could actually happen pending the board calendar. Some of the ideas behind this is the County Budget Act requires really 2 things on this front. One is adoption of a proposed budget, or what we call a spending plan, to occur before June 30th of every year. And that sets your spending authority for July 1st moving forward. They do also require a final budget adoption on or before October 2nd of each year. So that's where we come back at the end of September. We clean up or do all of our year-end processing, have our final budget numbers, input the carryover fund balance numbers and the increased budget. That's why you see a difference between the proposed budget amount and the final budget amount. And I think this year it went from $960 million or so, $940 million, up to the $1.3 billion. So some of those things were included in that process change. We can accomplish both actions in June, before June 30th, and still be in compliance with the Budget Act. The reason for 2 board meetings is to give the community and the departments and the board the chance to review the proposed budget, recommend any changes that need to be made, come back 2 weeks later and notice that, and then adopt that new budget. So we still meet those objectives and those timelines. This timeline doesn't change the department schedules or staff schedules as far as rolling things out and when those budgets are due back to us, or their narrative submissions. Those will still all be on a very similar time frame, so there should be not a major time impact to anybody. And key point is it doesn't change or eliminate a department's ability to amend their adopted budget. So just because we adopted in June instead of September, departments will have the ability to come back and request amendments to their final budgets based on year-end close numbers if need be, one-time expenses. We mentioned coming back mid-year and say, hey, I need that those funds for this project or this expense. None of that goes away through this process. We just treat it really as a budget amendment rather than a new final budget adoption. So we've done some research. I've worked with Andy. Thank you, Andy. Just looking at different counties and their processes and policies, and it's split, and how many go in June and September, or how many double, do the adoption in June and then just amend the budget. We were looking at Santa Barbara County most recently and how they structure their process. So it's not out of sorts with what other jurisdictions are doing.
Let me just, I'll touch on this a little bit. So, basically what we were doing is waiting for the state to adopt their budget. And that was historically, they kind of delayed it until something occurred, what, no way, I don't know, what is it, 08, 09, something like that, that required them to adopt a budget prior to June 30th of that fiscal year leading up to the new fiscal year. So now we have a budget, and I think it got adopted at the state on the 12th of June. The intent here is really not substantively different. It's more terminology than it is anything else. Our intent is adopting a budget, a final budget, to start the new fiscal year off. So we do it by the end of June. You start the year off. The cleanup, the only thing that's really happening here is at year end there's rollovers. There's encumbrances that haven't been incurred. There's capital items that we haven't exhausted, all those. We'd still be coming back to you in August, September with a budget revision to the final budget that you adopted in June and say, hey, this is the carryover amount. The only thing that's different here is departments would still want to talk about requests that they didn't get funded in the current budget development process that we did. They'd like to have that conversation in July, August, and then we'd come in September. My thought here is we'll bring forward the carry forward at the same time frame once the close of the year is. Those are those carry forwards and encumbrances. If departments have needs or requests above it, that is a separate conversation. It's not part of the budget development process. That's the only thing that's substantively different. And as Daniel had alluded to, they would still, if there is a need after the budget had been finalized, they'd still have the opportunity to bring it forward to you as a board. It would just be a separate item about, hey, we identified something after the budget, the final budget was approved, and we're moving forward with requesting this to be added to the budget. We do this through the course of the year. Grants come up. You see this in all your things. Hey, we have a grant. We need to appropriate money to account for that grant, or some department needs something through the course of the year. That's the only change is departments wouldn't be asking for stuff they didn't receive through this kind of final budget component that happens in September.
So you anticipate how many departments can you anticipate coming in September to ask for these?
You know what? It's been. I would hope it's rare. I mean, that should be an exception. I mean, my ultimate goal here, and I think and some departments can hopefully attest to this, is I want them to think and have planning horizons. We've asked them to do 5-year CIP plans. We've asked them to think kind of really longer term about their budget. I would, and part of this is expectations on the CO staff from the budget standpoint. We've captured everything in their budget and had good dialogue with departments. So, if there was no, it's not going to happen right now, they're not saying, okay, well, I get kind of another crack at the apple leading up to September. That's the only change that would occur, but it doesn't preclude them from asking. I would hope there isn't that many.
My perspective is the budget is a plan. And you've got to lay out the plan for the start of the fiscal year in July 1 with some goals and objectives. And if there are changes, and there always are changes and amendments and things that come up that we're going to have to respond to, that we're doing that, but that everybody starts the year at the same time. And then and I guess the question would be, if we ever went back to years of past when the state didn't adopt a budget and it went months and things happened, obviously that's a significant change to some of our departments and some of the issues, and we may for that reason, say this is tentative, or we're not gonna do the budget till then, but we can never project.
I'd love
Yeah.
to keep that flexibility in
Mm.
check.
Yeah.
I will tell you, I don't think that'll ever happen again because
Yeah.
the requirement that they don't get paid if they don't have a budget.
We hope that helps, but.
Yeah, there's some psychology there. but-
There were some times that it was pretty tense for,
Yeah.
for smaller local governments in those days. But given this, I would hope we could work within those timelines and people would see the wisdom of let's get to it, let's make a budget plan and start at July 1 with our budget, so.
And we kind
I
of do
just
that.
only add that, I was always told that we did that pending the state's resolution for September. But it sounds like you've thought through that well. It sounds like it's a tighter budgeting process to me. I guess I don't want it to drive an exorbitant number of budget revisions that, but on the other hand, you do want to highlight to the board the kinds of things that are more compelling and policy oriented.
What I'd ask is if we try this year and see if there's any significant issues, to have the flexibility to bring it back to you next year and say, hey, maybe that's not the right mix.
Yeah, this is one that I'm looking at and I'm thinking, what's the compelling interest in the change? I frankly, knowing that it takes us a little while to finalize the prior fiscal year, I've never had any qualms about operating under the adoption of a preliminary budget for the couple of months. And in my mind, I've always just reconciled the fact that we're going to adopt our preliminary budget consistent with the state's fiscal year, and we'll adopt our final consistent with the federal fiscal year. And during that period, we are reconciling what our actuals were for the prior year, so that by the time we have an adoption of our final budget, we do have our actuals for the final year. And I just feel more comfortable, frankly, that way. I'm certainly willing to give it a try a different way. I just don't see this as being one of those compelling needs for a change kind of a thing, so I always took some comfort in the fact that we were able to adopt a budget in June that we knew set a solid template for service delivery for the next year, but there was going to be an opportunity for changes based on what things actually came in at from the prior year. So I'm willing to give it a try. This is one of those, the old default to the status quo, unless you can make the argument as compelling as can be as to why the status quo needs to be changed. Yeah. I'd rather spend our time working on zero-based budgeting.
That might take toll.
Well, let me throw this out there then. I would just set the expectation for departments and elected offices that once we have a preliminary budget at the end of June, that the majority, unless there's just really unknown items that come up at that point, that there isn't a request for additional things that they may have not asked for before.
Entirely. And that's why I've always, that period between July 1 and September 30, or whenever we do adopt that final budget, I've always looked at it from the standpoint of projected expenditures in this particular department went a little higher. We don't have the fund balance carryover that we're anticipating. We're going to need to reallocate some dollars over, to shore that up, or revenues came in higher than we thought, and now we are in a position where we make an additional contribution to our capital reserve or whatever, and then we make that consistent with the final budget. But I have never looked at that period between preliminary adoption and final adoption as the silly season of lobbying board members for projects or priorities. I think we've done a very good job, frankly, of opening up that to all year long, as opposed to the way that we used to do it, where it was a very short window where people come in and beat on us about their priorities, and so.
Well, if you feel comfortable in that scenario, that's kind of was my approach. So I know that was my only beef about it. I'd much rather focus on closing out the year, addressing any capital needs that weren't in so we make sure that any carry forwards take place, than debating whether there's still needs that they want to.
And I don't know that we have much of a history of the board changing priorities that much in terms of programs or things like that from our preliminary to our final. I don't think we really have a history of doing that.
Okay.
I think it's historically just been, fund balance carryover was higher than we thought.
Yeah.
And so what do you want to do with the money? And then we adopt that final. Something about the optic, and we've now heard it in public comment a couple of times, something about the optic of adopting a final budget that we call final in June, and then coming back after we've done the reconciliation to adopt our new final budget. We have had a couple of comments in public comment about adopt your budget and stick with it. Well,
yeah, and again, it's a plan, right?
Yeah.
We could just adopt it in June and be done with it, and then make any changes in September. And that's sort of, because what ended up happening is then they thought, oh, well, we actually didn't do the work we did in June. That's
Right.
what happened, was we had done all this work in June, and we came back in September to adopt it, and they didn't think we had been
I see
upfront
what you're
and
saying.
transparent.
Yeah.
So we spent 3 months,
Yeah.
in between, and they'd forgotten that we'd spent all this time
Mm-hmm.
in June doing the upfront work.
Oh.
I'm okay with adopting it in June, starting off the fiscal year with a plan and then making changes come September, but I don't know, to me, it's whatever works best for y'all.
What's the benefit to staff if we do this?
Well, I think a couple for the budget team. I mean, right now this is a 12-month process. The separation of June to September. It's a continuation of doing the same thing for the next 3 months and rebudgeting everything that was missed in the first cycle. So it might give staff an opportunity to address some other needs or other initiatives that we have, looking deeper into funds and make sure that they're meeting their expectations or new service levels and different things like that. Open up different opportunities for them to fill in other gaps. I think overall, if that process is countywide, I think if we adopted a final in June and came back, now it doesn't have to be September at that point. I just want to make that point that we've met our statutory requirement to adopt a final budget. So from that point on, we don't have to meet any other requirement except I think December 2nd.
October 2nd.
With the state controller schedules, and so that's in December. So in between June and whenever, we could come back with those budget amendments. Now, to make it less impactful for departments who have needs and things, we could create a document that consolidates many of these things and produce them into one amendment, so it's one action item by the board and not 45 or something like that, and kind of clean that up. But it doesn't necessarily have to follow any set schedule. And I think that those are benefits to us as staff in creating these documents. The amount of work that goes into preparing the proposed budget document is duplicated in September. So we are producing essentially the same document again with updated numbers. So this year we took the action of not publishing the proposed book, and that saved time and money to not produce that, and waited until September to produce the book that you were given just a couple weeks ago. So those are some of the benefits to the staff in this process, and kind of why we were supporting the idea.
That's a helpful explanation of why it would make sense for staff to do that, right? I mean, and if you can save some money and actually time and allow your staff to focus on maybe other projects during the interim, but I think that could be very helpful. As we talk about efficiencies, here's an opportunity for staff saying we want to be more efficient.
Well, I'm hearing you guys also, it's giving you another tool to, I think, give it a try, see how it works, and gives you another tool to kind of true up our budgets more in concert with philosophically what you're trying to accomplish, so I'm good with that.
Worth a
Yeah, so
try?
Sure.
Yeah, give it a
Jim, you okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, anything else?
So the last slide is just kind of a summary of what we've asked of direction for today. Asked for direction of? Reorganize them any way you want.
We know what you mean.
So looking at appropriating our general fund transfers as we requested, which would be for road fund, fire fund, well, actually maybe not fire fund now, but road fund, capital fund, I don't remember which ones they were. Maintaining the library fund, maintaining the current level of appropriation, and staying with the same process and methodology for both public safety and for HHS. Resetting our base budgets to reflect the historical actual revenue and expenditures. Include the 4% salary savings in our base budgets. Remove the unfunded positions across the county, and prepare and submit final budget for adoption to occur in June of 2020. And that summarizes what we've talked about in board concurrence. Then we'll move forward with those assumptions.
I think with the addition of starting to look at what we would do on a zero-based budget basis,
Okay. All right. Any other comments or questions? Obviously, we've been efficient with your time. We're out of sooner, but
The only other thought, and obviously being the newbie, I can continue to ask those questions. As we approach, and it kind of follows on Kirk's idea of zero-based budgeting, what else is out there that we're being asked for that may have a legitimate role for the county or county services? So if you look at investment in, we've talked a little bit, I'm definitely strong on depreciation schedules and investments and making sure we take care of what we've got. But when we look at forest fuels, or if we look at some of the other demands we're seeing and threats to our property values by catastrophic wildfire, those sorts of things, or more investment in roads to bring our roads up to speed. Because if we really look at our assets and find we're way underfunded on some things, how do we at least articulate those as future goals to address? And so I think it's helpful to have that list and be able to talk, what that might take to get there. And then we can tell our constituents, look, at if you raise more revenue, or if you, how we incentivize them. I know what Jim and I have been talking a little bit about with the fire ad hoc is how do we incentivize people to invest more in a service we're already providing. And those sorts of things. So sometimes we need to kind of have that laundry list of a wish list. It's beyond wishes. It really is. People are asking us constantly for, additional services or additional investment to serve our constituents, and how we factor that in at some point in our discussions. Because if you just continue to look at what we've always done and how we've always done it, we never get to those items. Yes or no. Maybe is kind of where you end up. So.
Okay. I think.
Give us the $1,000 chart on what we would do new. How's that?
I think it would be an interesting one.
And it might be zero, and it might be
maybe zero.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about what does housing look like?
Yeah.
And what is
housing.
our involvement
Exactly.
in that?
Yeah.
We're going to have a legislative platform you're going to see in December that I would say from a federal standpoint more is about wildland forestry management is probably going to be a higher topic. What is our role in there? We're already doing some stuff on French Meadows and some of these other areas, which are really great projects. Is that something you still want to continue and expand upon some of that effort? So, okay, let me see what.
And I'm reacting more to not just what people want, but when they're faced with the fire insurance crisis, for instance, and we look at what profound impact that could have on property values. If you can't sell your home because the fire insurance is now $15,000 a year, and so now we're seeing people are asking, well, can you help us, or what can you do? What programs could you institute? or match us with to incentivize more fuel reduction in the communities, because we have invested and helped lead the charge on some of these ones that are a little further away,
Yeah.
but may not be resulting in benefits to fire insurance. Or do we not have a role? You know, but those are questions I get asked quite a bit, is how do we get more chippers? How do we get more help in these properties so that we can make sure our neighbors get things cleaned up if we don't? And
Yeah.
or are we going to take that enforcement role of mandating people to do that work and penalizing them for that if they don't? So.
Okay, well.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
think about
housing
how
is
we-
another good one, right? What's our role there and how much investment?
Yeah. Sometimes we lead, sometimes we facilitate, sometimes we
Convene.
support, convene.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, okay,
Yeah.
let me think about that a bit.
Well, just ideas to where we
Okay.
have.
Well, this is a good starting point. I think it helps us set the stage for 2021. Obviously, Daniel squared, you guys both feel good about kind of where we're at? All right. So I appreciate them helping with all the work putting this together. Hopefully it gives you a foundation to start from, and then we'll come back and keep you updated on what's kind of going on with this process. Any questions? Otherwise,
Nope.
we are done early.
Good job, thank you very much. I appreciate getting the slides.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
that was very
so
helpful.
there being no other questions or comments, we are adjourned to our regularly scheduled board meeting next Tuesday, the 19th.
Great.